Hi, this is Eric Johnson with the Alaska Homestead School, and today I thought I would talk about Arctic kiwis. It's a sunny day in late March here in Alaska, and we can talk a little bit about Arctic kiwis and not only how they grow, but how to propagate them. So Arctic kiwis are kiwis just like you'd buy in the store, except that they don't have any fuzz on their skin, and they're quite a bit smaller. They're usually the size of a blueberry to a grape. They grow on vines, and you can see down here several plants that I've had for maybe 4 or 5 years now, and they grow very, very fast in the summertime. Oftentimes the side shoots can put 6 to 8 feet on. And so you can see I've built a trellis in between 2 birch trees. And this is what I allow the kiwis to grow on. You can grow them along fences, on lattice, or any number of things. The beauty of a trellis system like this is that I can come underneath, and it makes it a lot easier to pick the fruits from underneath when they're ripe. This variety of kiwi is Actinidia colomitica, also known as Arctic Beauty kiwi. They're a little different than what's often sold as hardy kiwis. Those are Actinidia arguta. And I do actually have one of those plants growing right here. But I find that it's less hardy and less vigorous than Actinidia colomitica. We're going to go ahead and talk about how to propagate these, and I've been propagating these the last couple months, and I'll show you both my successes and failures. They're pretty easy to propagate. In fact, I've had 100% success so far, but I did have a few trial and error sessions last winter before I could figure out exactly how to do this. So if you take a look here right in front of me, you can see the female plant. And if you take a look, I've trained these plants so that they have a main stem that comes up towards the trellis, and then about 4 feet from the trellis branches off into 4 main branches, which then grows along the trellis wires. My camera doesn't necessarily want to focus on the plant itself, but let me see if I can show you what I got going on here. I've got a main stem coming up from the ground about 4 or 5 feet, and from there I've got it going to 3 or 4 different branches that then lead up to the trellis. So this little shoot right here, if you can see it, this is going to be the one we'll cut off. It's kind of headed nowhere right now, and I don't really want main branches coming down this low. So we'll show you using this piece how to propagate kiwis and talk a little bit about my successes and failures. To cut this, we're just going to go ahead and cut it right next to the stem, and we'll bring this shoot, which is about 14 inches long or so, inside, and we'll show you the next step. We're here inside my very messy workspace, so please forgive me. But I want to talk a little bit about how to propagate these Arctic kiwis. They're really quite simple, but before we do that, I'd like to talk a little more about how the kiwis grow. So if you can take a look here, you'll see that these kiwi vines have nodes running up and down the vine. Now, if I had left this on the plant this summer, there would have been a side shoot that came out of each one of these nodes, and right at the base of that side shoot would have been a female flower that would have eventually produced a kiwi. So kiwi plants can produce an incredible amount of fruit because they're produced on the current season's growth, and the current season's growth tends to be pretty impressive. So in order to propagate this, we want to do 2 different things. First, we want to take our clippers and we want to cut the base of the stem. And when we want to cut at a really sharp angle so that we expose quite a bit of the cadmium layer underneath the bark, which is where we'll get a lot of our root growth. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that and show you in just a minute. If you take a look, you can see the cut that I made at the base of the stem, and I tried to make it as long as I possibly could, because again, all of this green that you see inside the stem, this is where you're going to get root growth from, and so it's important that you provide a lot of surface area so that roots can grow out of this stem. The next thing I'm going to do is take a sharp knife, and I'm going to go ahead and wound the bark on this side of the stem, again just to allow more area for roots to develop. Okay, I've taken a sharp knife and I've wounded this side of the cutting. So I have a wound here. You can see lots of the green cadmium layer, and then you have this side where I cut it through with the shears. So the next step is we need to take this and dip it in rooting hormone. So I'll go ahead and do that now. This is the rooting hormone that I tend to use. There's a lot of different types and varieties out there. There's some that you mix with water. There's some that come in a gel form. And this is just a rooting powder. Pretty easy to use. You just unscrew the cap. See plenty of powder left in there. I really should be using gloves. Supposedly this stuff's kind of nasty. You mix your cut end in the powder. And then I like to leave it for a little while I prepare the pot for propagating. If the idea of hormone powder sketches you out a little bit, willow cuttings and willow water, where you take pieces of willow and soak it in water, also is known to help stimulate root growth, and that tends to be maybe a less toxic option. I'll get my soil. It's time to go ahead and put my cutting in the soil. Normally I would wet this down slightly first and then place the cutting in there, and then just give it a very light watering in order to get the soil in contact with the stem. I'm using 1 gallon trade pots. They're about 0.66 true gallons. And I like to stick the rooted cutting all the way to the bottom. The next thing you want to do is you want to cut off the top so that you only have one node. So if you can see here, I've got a node right here. And so I'm going to want to go ahead and cut it off slightly above that node. Alright. Now, you can see I've got a second cutting. And in a pot like this, I might place 15 to 20 cuttings until they've started to root and I put them in their own pots. So I'll go ahead and slice and wound this one and go ahead and stick it in as well. Alright, let's talk a little bit about the cuttings and how they work. You can see here that these are some female kiwis that I went ahead and cut and propagated, maybe a week and a half ago. You'll notice that the tops here have white on them. So one of the things you can do to help the success of your propagation is to add a little bit of wax or even latex paint, which this is, to the top of each of your cuttings. And that just helps from the tops drying out and just gives your cuttings a better start. If you look closely, you can see that each one of these has a node sticking out of the soil, and sure enough, every single one is starting to bud out. Let me pause here to talk about a mistake I made last year. So last year I did the same thing with hardwood kiwi cuttings, and I put a gallon Ziploc bag on top of each of these pots with the idea that it would retain additional moisture. What I found out was that by doing so, where each of these nodes are, not only did I have leaves coming out, but also roots as well. And so as soon as I took the Ziploc bag out and off of the plants, because they had all these roots exposed at each node, they very quickly died. For another example, let's take a look at the male kiwi plants that I propagated here, 4 or 5 weeks ago probably. You can see I've got 100% take on each of these, and some fairly good growth as well. Now let's take a look at where I messed up. Look at this sad, sad thing. So these were all healthy female kiwis a few weeks back, and I saw that the roots had started to grow and decided that I would take them out of the potting soil that I have and put them into regular garden soil. Well, I was not nearly gentle enough with the cuttings, and in the process I damaged 1 or 2 of the vines. I ended up dumping the pot over and messing a whole bunch up, and you can see they died 100%. So keep this in mind when you take your cuttings and you repot them. Make sure that you are extra gentle with them in this process, at least until they have more substantial roots than these guys did. A couple other things I want to note. You'll notice the blue tape here on the pot. If you're taking cuttings from both male and female plants, it's really important that you find a way to distinguish between the two. So I had some painter's tape laying around, and I just wrapped the female pots in painter's tape so I could keep track of which plants were male and female. If you don't do this, you're going to have to wait a whole nother year to see the shape of the flower before you can determine whether you have a male or female plant. Went ahead and took one of these male plants out of the pot to show you what 5 or 6 weeks of growth look like. And you can see there's not a lot happening here yet. However, you can see that the plant has a pretty good callus on the cut end. You can see these roots starting to come out of the callus. You'll notice a root or 2 coming out where I wounded the plant. And if you take a look at this node that was buried underground, you'll notice that that too has roots growing. So these plants clearly need some more time before they're put out either into the garden or into other plants. But this is what you're aiming for. 2 more quick thoughts before I leave you today. Kiwis are most often propagated from softwood cuttings in the summer. And so that's taking the current year's growth and doing essentially the same thing. I wanted to try doing it with hardwood cuttings in the winter. It's Alaska. I've got lots of spare time in the wintertime. And sure enough, it does seem that I can get nearly 100% success rate on propagation using hardwood cuttings with this method. One last thing I should mention is that these plants have been under bottom heat the whole time. I have a seed starting heat mat underneath the pot. And that seems to also help stimulate this root growth. Good luck out there, everyone.